It's just before 3 in the morning on a warm June night in 2015. A police dispatcher answers an unexpected call. A man's voice, unnervingly calm, says, "Yes. I have a problem. My girlfriend has fallen in the water." There is no panic, no plea for urgent help, only a flat statement of fact. Outside, the Suriname River, broad and dark, slides past the capital city's quiet waterfront. The caller tells officers that his companion fell from the riverside embankment, then vanished beneath those black waters moments ago. 3 days later, the body of a young Dutch tourist is found downstream on a muddy riverbank near an old sawmill. Local authorities treat it as a tragic accident, a drunken misstep on a holiday night. But back in the Netherlands, the victim's family is asking questions. Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname, sits on low, humid banks along a wide brown river. By day, the Suriname River is busy with boats and lined with colonial-era buildings. By night, its waters turn black, hiding strong currents beneath the surface. It was here, in this culturally rich but unfamiliar setting, that Aradhana Nazir found herself in June 2015. Aradhana was a 29-year-old visitor from the Netherlands, one of many Dutch citizens drawn to Suriname by deep historical ties. Suriname, a former Dutch colony on the northern coast of South America, shares the Dutch language and an intertwined history with the Netherlands. In Aradhana's case, the connection was personal. Her family was of Surinamese Hindustani origin. Visiting Paramaribo for a holiday meant reconnecting with cultural roots and relatives, a trip that should have been joyful. The tropical climate, the mix of Caribbean and South Asian influences, the palm-lined riverfront of Paramaribo, all of it must have felt both exotic and somehow familiar to a young woman whose parents were born here. She arrived with her mother and father for a summer vacation, expecting nothing more dangerous than perhaps a stray mosquito or a tropical storm. Aradhana Nazir was, by all accounts, an intelligent and caring young woman. She had recently completed her studies in law and was ready to embark on a promising career. Friends and family knew her as kind and ambitious, someone who balanced modern Dutch life with pride in her Surinamese heritage. Standing at the cusp of 30, Aradhana was thinking about the future, advancing in her profession, maybe settling down to start a family of her own. By that summer of 2015, she was living with her parents in the city of Almere, near Amsterdam, saving money and planning her next steps. In Almere, she had met a man named Sharid, and he had swiftly become the center of her world. Sharid was a few years older than Aradhana. In 2015, he was 34 years old, originally from Amsterdam, and projected confidence and charm. He wasn't widely known outside his social circles, but those who met him often found him engaging. As one Dutch psychologist would later describe him, a smooth talker. Sharid had dabbled in business. At one point he ran an Amsterdam cafe, and he had experience selling insurance policies. To Aradhana, he must have seemed entrepreneurial and worldly. She fell in love with him quickly. Aradhana believed Sharid was her great love, and imagined a beautiful future together. In her eyes, Sharid was someone to build a life with. He spoke sweetly of moving in together and building a home. Not everyone was convinced by his act. Aradhana's parents quietly objected to the relationship, sensing something was off about the charming older boyfriend. But Aradhana's heart was set. In text messages shortly before the trip, she told Sharid she would do anything for him. She trusted him completely. That trust would cost Aradhana everything. Unbeknownst to her, Sharid was living a double life. Behind the romantic promises, he was systematically exploiting Aradhana for financial gain. In the 2 years since they'd begun dating in 2013, Aradhana's once stable finances had spiraled into disarray. At the start of their relationship, she had healthy savings and no significant debts. But Sharid had persuaded, or conned, her into entanglements that left her bank accounts empty. He opened new bank accounts in her name and even had her officially registered at a different address, as if she'd already moved in with him. He put her on paper as an employee of a company he owned, generating fake payslips and employer statements, all to help take out loans and credit in her name. Over time, large sums of money drained out of Aradhana's accounts. Investigators would later find that a substantial transfer from her savings account went directly into Sharid's business account. Costly purchases, electronics, luxury goods, were made using Aradhana's bank cards, but the items were delivered to and found in the home of another woman, a girlfriend of Sharid's, known as M. In fact, several bills for this other girlfriend M were paid from Aradhana's funds. WhatsApp messages later recovered from Sharid's phone showed him instructing Aradhana to withdraw large cash amounts for him, and even using her bank card and PIN himself to take money out. Bit by bit, Aradhana's assets were siphoned away. By June 2015, she was unknowingly deep in debt, her savings gone. She didn't know it, but she had been, as one investigator put it, financially emptied out by the man she loved. Aradhana saw none of this as a reason to doubt Sharid's affection. He had an explanation for everything, and she believed him. When he urged her to take out new financial products, a mortgage here, a loan there, it was framed as steps toward their shared future. He even convinced her to rent an apartment ostensibly for the two of them, while she still mostly lived at home. She paid for a lease on a place she barely stayed in, because Sharid said they needed it. At one point, he orchestrated a loan through one of his own relatives. Under pressure from Sharid, Aradhana signed for a loan from his aunt, intended as down payment for a house. The mortgage plan ultimately failed, but the aunt's loan was never repaid, leaving Aradhana on the hook. By the summer of 2015, almost nothing remained in Aradhana's name that Sharid hadn't tapped, and still, he kept up the charade of love. Aradhana remained blissfully unaware that she was being used. As far as she knew, these sacrifices were part of building a life together. She had no idea that Sharid was simultaneously courting multiple other women, and that he viewed her not as a partner, but as a means to an end. If Aradhana's family had reservations about Sharid, they were sadly vindicated. But at the time, Aradhana defended him. Even as her bank balances dwindled and strange transactions piled up, she didn't suspect fraud, because she never imagined her boyfriend could betray her so deeply. In late June 2015, Aradhana and her parents flew to Suriname for a vacation, and Sharid joined them. It was an opportunity for him to present himself as a dutiful partner in front of her family, perhaps to dispel their doubts. According to later testimony, on the night of June 25, 2015, the couple joined some relatives in Paramaribo for dinner. The city's air was hot and heavy that evening, and over dinner, Aradhana drank more than she usually would. By the end of the meal, she was intoxicated. She had a bit too much to drink, as Sharid would casually describe it later. Sharid had actively encouraged this. Earlier that day, he had taken Aradhana to purchase 2 bottles of a locally made high-proof rum, a potent spirit called palm rum, 90% alcohol by volume. He even snapped photographs of Aradhana posing with these bottles in her hands. After dinner, sometime before midnight, Sharid suggested that he and Aradhana take a short drive to a nearby spot by the Suriname River, a little nighttime excursion for just the two of them. He told her it was a beautiful viewpoint where one could see the lights reflecting on the water. Trustingly, Aradhana went along. She was tipsy and sleepy from the rum, but Sharid led her to believe this was a romantic capstone to their evening. In truth, the location was anything but romantic. It was a quiet stretch of riverfront near downtown Paramaribo, not far from an industrial area. By day, one could see a concrete factory across the water. At night, the area was dark and deserted. It wasn't a place tourists normally went for scenic views. Yet Sharid had singled it out, and investigators later learned he knew this spot very well. A female acquaintance in Suriname would recall that Sharid had brought her to the same riverside once and called it his spot, a place he liked to visit when he wanted peace and quiet. This contradicted what he would later claim. that he stumbled upon the location by chance. In reality, Sharid had chosen the ground for what was about to happen. Around 2:30 in the morning of June 26th, Sharid and Aradhana arrived at the river's edge. The air was warm and still. The city around them had gone to sleep, leaving only the sound of insects and the slow rush of the Suriname River passing by. Aradhana, feeling dizzy from alcohol, sat on the low concrete embankment, a sort of small wall or ledge along the riverbank. According to Sharid's later statement, she said she was feeling unwell and needed to lie down for a moment. Sharid claimed that Aradhana stretched out along the top of the wall by the water. From that perch, the river below was a drop of a few feet. The water was deep and fast-moving close to the bank. If someone fell in, the current could sweep them away in seconds. Crucially, Aradhana did not know how to swim. Her loved ones would later question why Sharid didn't stay right by her side, knowing she was drunk and helpless near a dangerous river. But Sharid's story was that at this moment, he stepped away to relieve himself behind some nearby bushes. He said he left Aradhana alone for just a minute or two. In that brief span, he claimed, tragedy struck. Sharid would tell police that he heard a splash and turned to see nothing but ripples in the dark water. In his account, Aradhana must have accidentally rolled off the wall and fallen into the river in her stupor. He ran back just in time to catch a glimpse of her hair disappearing into the current. Then she was gone. It all happened in an instant, Sharid said. He shouted her name, but there was no response. He couldn't see her in the murky water and the night, and he did nothing else. He did not jump in after her or attempt to rescue. Later, when asked why he hadn't tried to save the woman he loved, Sharid claimed it was because he himself could not swim. It sounded plausible enough in the moment. A panicked non-swimmer might fear diving into a river at night. But this was yet another lie. Sharid was an excellent swimmer and even held a scuba diving certification. At the time, however, no one was there to challenge his account. He was the sole witness to Aradhana's disappearance. At 2:50 a.m., Sharid placed a call to 115, the Surinamese emergency number. The recording of this call would later strike investigators as strange. Sharid's voice was oddly composed given the situation. "Yes, I have a problem. My girlfriend has fallen in the water." He spoke almost as if describing a minor inconvenience, not a life-or-death emergency. Crucially, he did not plead with the operator to send help quickly, nor did he express any shock or despair in those first moments. Sharid simply stated what had happened and answered a few questions. He reported the location, a spot by the Suriname River in Paramaribo, and the basic facts that his girlfriend was drunk, had fallen in, and disappeared under the water. He mentioned she just fell, and that he couldn't see her anymore. The dispatcher took down the details and assured him that police and emergency services would be alerted. Within minutes, local police patrols and firefighters were dispatched to the riverside location. They arrived to find an apparently distraught Sharid waiting by the quay. It was dark, and there was little they could do immediately except shine flashlights on the water and scour the banks. A search and rescue operation was launched at first light, focusing on the stretch of river downstream. But the Suriname River is broad and murky. If someone drowns, the currents can carry the body a significant distance. For 3 anxious days, Aradhana's family, her parents, who were still in Paramaribo, waited for news. One can only imagine their anguish, a holiday that had turned into a nightmare. Their daughter vanished in a foreign land. Sharid played the part of the worried boyfriend. He stayed in touch with the family and authorities, ostensibly helping with the search. But those who interacted with him sensed something was off. Police later remarked that Sharid showed so little emotion for a man whose partner just drowned. Officers wondered why he hadn't kept a closer eye on Aradhana if she was so drunk, and why he hadn't gone in after her when she fell. When pressed on that point, he trotted out the excuse about not knowing how to swim. The local investigators had their doubts about his behavior, but doubts are not evidence of a crime. And in those first days, nothing clearly indicated foul play. As far as they could tell, it might truly have been a terrible accident, the kind that occasionally claims careless tourists or unlucky locals by the water's edge. On June 29th, the worst was confirmed. Aradhana's body was discovered by workers near a lumberyard a few kilometers downriver. It had been about 72 hours since her disappearance. The tropical heat and river fauna had affected the remains, but an autopsy in Suriname was able to conclude that Aradhana Nazir had drowned. There were no obvious signs of severe trauma or violence on the body, no bullet wounds, no stab marks, no fractures. In truth, given the circumstances, a subtle cause like smothering or a quick strangulation might not have left clear evidence after days in water, but the pathologist could not determine anything beyond drowning. With no eyewitnesses and no forensic proof of an assault, the authorities in Paramaribo treated the case as non-suspicious. The initial investigation was closed with the conclusion that there were no indications of a crime. Aradhana's grieving parents were left to arrange for their daughter's body to be flown home to the Netherlands for burial. Sharid expressed condolences. Then, almost immediately, he left Suriname. In fact, as soon as the formalities were done, Sharid booked a flight back to Amsterdam. He did not linger to comfort Aradhana's family for long. At the airport before departure, he snapped a selfie on his phone, smiling. It was a small detail, but one that investigators would later find telling. Back in the Netherlands, as Aradhana's relatives prepared for her funeral, uneasy questions continued to gnaw at them. Aradhana was gone, but certain things didn't add up. Chief among them was the discovery of a large life insurance policy in Aradhana's name. In the aftermath of Aradhana's death, her family went through her paperwork and personal effects. They discovered documents showing that just 6 weeks before the Suriname trip, Aradhana had taken out a new life insurance policy worth €300,000, and shortly afterward changed the beneficiary on that policy to Sharid. This was utterly surprising. Aradhana had never mentioned taking out life insurance. 29-year-olds in good health rarely expect to die, much less take out substantial policies on themselves. And why would she name her boyfriend of just 2 years as the beneficiary, instead of, say, her parents or sibling? The family knew nothing about it, which implied that Sharid had persuaded Aradhana to keep it quiet. The more they thought about it, the more distressed they became. The timing was chilling. The insurance had been arranged in May 2015, mere weeks before Aradhana's sudden death. Could that be a coincidence? To her family, it seemed too much to swallow. Aradhana's loved ones took their concerns and the insurance documents to the Dutch police. Though the tragedy had occurred in Suriname, the Netherlands has legal mechanisms to investigate crimes against its citizens abroad, especially if there are Dutch suspects or financial crimes involved. And here there clearly was a potential financial crime. If Aradhana's death was not accidental, then someone stood to gain €300,000 by it. The Dutch authorities were listening. By late 2015, a prosecutor in the Netherlands, Veenendaal van Weveren, opened a preliminary case focusing on attempted insurance fraud. The initial angle was simply to investigate whether Sharid had encouraged Aradhana to take that policy and then tried to collect on it under false pretenses. If nothing else, that was a crime on Dutch soil, a fraud against a Dutch insurance company. The team quietly requested all relevant files from Suriname via official mutual legal assistance channels. They obtained the Paramaribo police reports, the autopsy findings, witness statements that had been collected in Suriname. As expected, nothing in those documents pointed to murder. The case was closed as an accident there. Still, the Dutch investigators noted the same oddities the Surinamese had. Sharid's lack of emotion, his curious inaction when Aradhana fell, his too clean version of events. Suspicion was growing, but to build a case, they needed evidence. Dutch police also spoke extensively with Aradhana's family and friends. From them, a fuller picture of the relationship emerged, one that deeply alarmed investigators. Aradhana's relatives recounted how she had become financially entangled with Sharid, how she seemed to be spending money on things outside her normal habits. With the family's help, detectives started digging into bank records, emails, and phone data. What they found was a trail of deception spanning the entirety of Sharid and Aradhana's relationship. Over months of meticulous work, piece by piece, the Dutch police uncovered proof that Aradhana had been systematically defrauded and manipulated by her boyfriend long before that night in Suriname. It was as if Sharid had staged a slow, patient con, one that only culminated in Paramaribo. Crucially, they obtained a warrant to search Sharid's digital devices. His smartphone, once in hand, was a gold mine of incriminating information. Even though Sharid likely thought he'd covered his tracks, forensic analysts recovered deleted WhatsApp messages, photographs, and notes. On his phone, police found images of Aradhana's personal documents, her driver's license, passport, bank cards, even screenshots of her online banking login details. There were photos of the insurance policy itself and a scanned copy of Aradhana's signature. These weren't things an ordinary boyfriend would casually have. It looked as if he had gathered every tool needed to impersonate her and control her finances. This explained how he had opened accounts and taken out contracts in her name. He had her IDs and a copy of her signature ready to forge documents. In fact, during the later trial, Sharid's defense team produced a document, supposedly signed by Aradhana, acknowledging that she owed him a large sum of money, a kind of IOU. But an expert handwriting examination proved what the investigators already suspected. The signature on that debt acknowledgement was not freely written by Aradhana at all. It was lifted exactly from the digital copy of her signature found in Sharid's phone. It was a forgery, created to mislead the court into thinking Aradhana had real debts to Sharid. The careful planning was astounding. As more evidence emerged, the case widened from fraud into a full-fledged homicide inquiry. Margriet Kamper, a senior prosecutor in the Midden-Nederland district, took over and formed a task force with detectives to re-examine Aradhana's death as a possible murder. This was an uphill battle. They had to prove a killing that happened in a foreign country with no direct witnesses and no clear forensic proof. But the growing body of circumstantial evidence was compelling. Investigators re-interviewed anyone connected to Sharid. One of his former partners, the mother of his children from a prior relationship, recounted an unsettling conversation. Sharid had once asked her whether she would be willing to sit in prison for 4 years in exchange for €250,000. He added that he himself would be prepared to do that. At the time, she hadn't understood what he was implying, but in hindsight it sounded like he was contemplating a jail term in return for a big payoff, perhaps thinking of the insurance money. Another current girlfriend, the same whose bills were being paid with Aradhana's money, told police about promises Sharid had made. He had told her that they would soon go on a luxurious trip to Bali, and he urged her to just hold on a bit longer financially, because soon the bonus would arrive. By bonus, he explicitly meant a life insurance payout he was expecting. She had not known the details, but she certainly knew Sharid was juggling multiple women. In fact, Sharid had a pattern of stringing along several girlfriends at once. He lied extravagantly to each of them. Some mutual acquaintances, upon learning of the case, dubbed him Mr. 50 Shades of Grey, half-jokingly likening his manipulative romantic life to the fictional character with a double life. There was nothing romantic, however, about Sharid's real agenda. One witness provided a particularly chilling piece of the puzzle. A business associate of Sharid recalled that shortly before the Suriname trip, Sharid had made an ominous remark about Aradhana. He said that the girl would disappear. This was weeks before Aradhana's death. At the time, the associate didn't know what to make of it, perhaps thinking Sharid meant a breakup. But in context with what followed, it sounded like foreshadowing of murder. Investigators also confirmed that Sharid had urged Aradhana to actually bring the physical insurance policy documents with her on their vacation to Suriname. It seemed he wanted to have all necessary paperwork at hand once the deed was done. Indeed, in Suriname, right before Aradhana's death, Sharid had contacted the insurer, the Dutch company Dela, using a false name to double-check that the life insurance was active and would pay out abroad. In that phone call on June 16, 2015, he had casually said, "Just in case it's time soon." A darkly suggestive choice of words. Everything pointed to careful premeditation. Every lie Sharid told to cover his tracks was being stripped away by solid evidence. He claimed he didn't know the riverside spot, but a Surinamese friend swore he did, calling it his place. He claimed he had no idea how strong the rum was that Aradhana drank, but in those photos he took, 90% was emblazoned in big letters on the bottle label, impossible to miss. He said Aradhana herself wanted to go to that riverside, and investigators found messages he'd sent to people that night indicating she had wanted to see the river, a story he likely prepared to deflect suspicion. But why would he need to stress that unless he was already crafting an alibi? Why, indeed, had he allowed a woman who couldn't swim to sit drunk on a narrow wall by a fast river with no guardrail, unless he intended some harm? Piece by piece, a damning mosaic of circumstantial evidence took shape. No single fact proved murder on its own, but the combined picture was hard to ignore. By 2017, the Dutch authorities felt they had enough to make an arrest. Sharid was taken into custody in the Netherlands and officially accused of murder with premeditation, as well as charges of fraud, forgery, and attempted insurance swindle. He denied everything. Through interrogations and later in court, Sharid stuck to his story that Aradhana's death was a drunken accident and that any financial misdeeds were misunderstandings. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstance, a man who had perhaps made some poor choices in business but would never hurt the woman he loved. Investigators, however, had heard enough lies from Sharid to last a lifetime. They knew, for instance, that his claim of not swimming was false. They'd even found photos of him scuba diving. He had lied about his intentions in Suriname, about his finances, about other relationships. And he had tried to deceive the court with a forged IOU. His own phone contained the blueprint of his scheme. In one revealing discovery, police recovered a message Sharid had sent to a close confidant just after Aradhana's death, saying words to the effect that they just had to get through this, and then the bonus would be there. It echoed what he'd told his other girlfriend as well, emphasizing that the payday was coming once this unpleasant period of the investigation was over. It was a brazen admission of motive. The case went to trial in early 2019 at the court in Lelystad, in the Flevoland province of the Netherlands. Margriet Kamper and her team presented the painstakingly assembled puzzle to the judges. It was an unusual murder trial because the how of the killing remained uncertain even to the prosecution. In court, the prosecutor frankly acknowledged, "We cannot be sure exactly how he did it. Did Sharid push Aradhana off the wall while she was drunk? Or did he perhaps strangle or smother her first to ensure she wouldn't struggle, then tip her lifeless body into the river?" The physical evidence was inconclusive. All that was known is that Aradhana ended up in the water and drowned. But, the prosecutor argued, you didn't need to know the exact method of killing to see the intent behind it. All the steps Sharid took before, during, and after that night pointed to a deliberate plan to end Aradhana's life for financial gain. Every action was aimed at the victim dying so that the life insurance could be cashed, the prosecution asserted bluntly. They laid out the timeline. Sharid had Aradhana buy a €300,000 life insurance policy on May 7th, 2015. On June 1st, he had her change the beneficiary from her own parents to himself. He also arranged a secondary funeral insurance worth €10,000, again naming himself to receive the payout. In mid-June, before the trip, he called the insurer under an alias to verify the policy was active in case something soon happens. Then in Suriname, he isolated Aradhana in a vulnerable situation by the river in the middle of the night. Whether it was a push or worse, he ensured she drowned and made no attempt to save her. Immediately after, he set about trying to collect the money. He flew home, obtained an official death certificate by July 20th, and called the insurance company on July 21st to file the claim. On that call, Sharid asked if the death certificate was sufficient for the insurer to pay out the €300,000. He conveniently failed to mention to the insurance agent that he was under any suspicion or that a criminal investigation was brewing. In fact, investigators discovered that even weeks after Aradhana's death, Sharid was telling some people in his circle that she was still alive and reachable, as if covering his bases until the money came through. The motive was clear. Sharid's entire relationship with Aradhana had been exclusively focused on financial gain, as the prosecutor said in court. When he had drained her of all he could, he sought one last, gruesome payout through her death. Shareed's defense attorney pushed back, pointing out that there was still no direct proof of a violent act. They argued it was a chain of coincidences being unfairly woven into a narrative of murder. Shareed himself took the stand to maintain his innocence. He claimed the insurance was her idea, or merely a prudent step because Aradhana supposedly owed him some money, a claim thoroughly debunked by the forged IOU. He stuck to the story that she fell by accident. But his credibility was practically zero at this point. The judges in the Lelystad court had to weigh a unique case. A murder in which the exact killing wasn't seen or recorded, but where virtually every other surrounding fact screamed foul play. In February 2019, the Dutch court rendered its verdict. They found Shareed guilty of murder, rejecting the accident explanation as a pack of lies. The judges agreed this was a cold-blooded crime driven by financial motive. In addition to murder, Shareed was convicted of multiple counts of fraud, including the attempted insurance fraud and mortgage fraud, and the forgery of documents. The sentence was severe, 20 years in prison, exactly what the prosecution had requested. For context, in the Netherlands, a 20-year term is an extremely heavy sentence, short of the rare life imprisonment, reflecting the court's view of the crime's gravity. Shareed, 37 years old at sentencing, would be behind bars until well into his 50s. In their judgment, the Dutch judges described him as calculating and merciless. A psychiatric evaluation had found no treatable mental disorder. Shareed wasn't insane or out of control, just profoundly amoral. He was essentially a slick con artist with psychopathic traits. Throughout the trial, he had shown no real remorse. In fact, his attitude in court, defiant, often evasive, counted against him. The prosecution noted his conduct during the trial as aggravating. He lied to the end and even tried to mislead the court with forged evidence. The judges concurred, emphasizing how he had exploited Aradhana's love and trust to literally ruin her life. At sentencing, the court pointed out that Aradhana had been a young woman with so much potential, a recent law graduate eager to contribute to society, and that Shareed robbed her and her family of that future. Shareed immediately filed an appeal. He was not going to accept a 20-year sentence without a fight. In the Netherlands, appeals in serious criminal cases are heard by a court of appeal with a new panel of judges. Shareed's appeal went to the Hof in Leeuwarden. There, in 2020 and 2021, the case was re-examined. Shareed and his defense seemed to pin hopes on finding inconsistencies or raising doubts that the first court had overlooked. At one dramatic juncture, Shareed even attempted to recuse the appellate judges, formally accusing them of bias in an effort to get a different set of judges. This maneuver, which is relatively rare, was quickly rejected by the court. This time, given Shareed's obstinacy and lack of remorse, the prosecution asked for an even harsher sentence, 22 years. But the appellate court would ultimately decide to uphold the original punishment. In April 2021, the Leeuwarden Court of Appeal delivered its decision. Shareed remains guilty on all counts, and the sentence of 20 years stands. Aradhana Nazir would be 39 years old this year had she lived. She might have been a practicing lawyer, perhaps married with children, contributing to her community. Shareed stole that life from her, betraying her love in the most callous way for money he ultimately never obtained.